When I first saw the initial telemetry from 3i Atlas, I assumed it was just another interstellar body passing quietly through our system. We've had visitors before, and most of them slipped past us without ever saying a word. But this one didn't behave like the others, and the more I looked, the more the data refused to stay silent. 3i Atlas was first logged as a routine object, an interstellar traveler on a shallow inbound arc. Its brightness curve was odd, its motion slightly irregular, but nothing that demanded immediate concern. At least that's what I believed, until I read the early tracking notes from the Atlas survey teams. Their measurements hinted at a hollow structure, unusually low density, and a trajectory that felt intentional. It wasn't enough to draw conclusions, but it was enough to make me watch. The real shift came hours before dawn on October 17th, when a technician at the Deep Space Network noticed a pattern in the background: hiss, a structured pulse emerging from the noise. 11.3 seconds on, 47 minutes off, then again, and again. It was the kind of precision that natural sources rarely achieve. They cross-checked it with other antennas. Same result. Not an echo, not interference, a broadcast. That was the first moment I realized we were dealing with something fundamentally different. I kept wondering why the signal chose that exact frequency. When they analyzed it, the answer was almost unsettling. It came through at 1.42 GHz, the hydrogen line, the so-called water hole, the universal landmark for communication. If someone wanted to be heard by any civilization capable of radio astronomy, that is where they would speak. Some researchers whispered that this was too perfect to be a coincidence. Others argued that the universe is full of coincidences, but coincidences don't repeat with mathematical elegance. The first internal reports described layered modulations hidden within the pulse, structures repeating at 1.7 seconds, and even faster flickers nested inside those. It reminded me of Morse code, but multiplied across several dimensions. Each time I looked at the spectrograms, I had the same quiet thought: natural processes don't do this. Not with this kind of hierarchy. Yet no one wanted to say it aloud. As the teams ruled out every known astrophysical source, pulsars, magnetars, quasars, another detail emerged. The pulse was strengthening over time, becoming clearer, sharper, as if something inside that object was adjusting, tuning itself, waking up. And that was when the atmosphere inside the control room shifted. Skepticism gave way to a kind of disciplined fascination. No panic, just the silent gravity of an unprecedented event. But the moment that changed everything came 3 days later. The wide, steady beacon suddenly narrowed. A new trajectory analysis confirmed it. The beam was now aimed directly at Earth. Not drifting, not accidental, deliberate. I remember staring at the alignment logs, wondering why an object that had been quiet for months would choose now to focus on us. Some insiders hinted the readings weren't complete, that parts of the raw data vanished from the system too quickly. Others insisted it was just routine housekeeping. Still, I've worked long enough with observatory archives to know when a gap is more than a gap. Then came the frequency analysis, the one that erased the last of my doubt. The pulse was far too coherent to be random. Every expert who examined it, from cryptographers to RF engineers, reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. The probability of a natural origin was essentially zero. It wasn't a comet, it wasn't a rock, it was a transmitter. One detail keeps echoing in my mind: the timing. The signal shifted to a directed beam exactly 9 days before 3i Atlas was set to pass behind the sun. For 3 weeks we would lose sight of it completely. Was the timing a coincidence or a message? A final announcement before silence? Even now I can't explain why the data files from that night were replaced so quickly, or why some instruments recorded electromagnetic noise that didn't match any solar activity. No one has offered a clear answer. What I do know is this: the signal happened. It was real. And it was intentional. Whether it was a greeting, a warning, or something far more complex, that remains to be seen. For now, the truth sits somewhere between the numbers and the silence, waiting for us to catch up. I'll get to what happened next soon. I kept replaying the moment when the signal turned toward Earth, trying to understand why the shift happened exactly then. It wasn't the power of the pulse that unsettled me. It was the precision. Objects don't just wake up and decide to focus on one specific planet unless there is a reason. In the internal reports collected that week, one detail appeared repeatedly. The 11.3-second cycle was not static. It carried structure, nested layers of modulation, each behaving like a different timescale of information. When I looked closely at the spectrograms, I noticed a pattern that reminded me of stacked clocks, overlapping yet coherent. The deeper the analysis went, the more the signal resembled a system that had been dormant and was now gradually calibrating itself. Some analysts joked about it, stretching its legs, but no one truly laughed. The tone in those rooms had already changed. The next development came earlier than expected. 3 days after the first detection, the wide omnidirectional pulse collapsed into a narrow beam. That collapse wasn't chaotic. The alignment with Earth was too exact to dismiss as drift. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory ran orbital simulations repeatedly, and each one showed the same improbable conclusion. The beam's orientation matched Earth's position with near-perfect accuracy. Natural radio sources don't behave that way. They scatter, they diffuse, they don't aim. When the signal hit the hydrogen frequency, something clicked in my mind. The waterhole band isn't random. It is a conceptual meeting place that astronomers have discussed for decades, a quiet refuge in the galactic spectrum, a channel where intelligent species might choose to speak. In theory. And yet here it was, in practice, lighting up our receivers with a message that seemed tailor-made to be recognized. Some observers, speaking off record, suggested that the pulse was almost too clean, too deliberate. Others asked why it chose to reveal itself now. None of those questions had answers. But the part that stayed with me, the part that never felt comfortable, was the timing relative to perihelion. 9 days before the object would pass behind the sun, the pulse shifted from a beacon to a spotlight. It was almost as if it needed to say something before disappearing. A final notice, a last alignment. We couldn't follow it behind the solar glare. Physics wouldn't allow it, and if the object knew that, then the message felt less like an accident and more like a deadline. Inside the control rooms, the atmosphere was unlike anything I'd seen. Not fear, not hysteria. It was closer to reverence, the kind of silence that fills old observatories moments before a long-awaited transit. Everyone understood the significance. If the signal was artificial, then the implications extended far beyond the object itself. Yet, strangely, no public announcement followed. There were no press releases, no large briefings. It wasn't secrecy, it was caution. This was a situation with no precedent. Some of the briefings contained fragments of information that didn't appear in the main logs. For instance, certain radar readings from the night of the beam alignment were missing. Not corrupted, missing, removed from the archive within hours. Why? No one clarified. A coincidence? Maybe. But coincidences in this dataset were becoming harder to accept at face value. As the signal strengthened, the nested structures inside the pulse began to evolve. Analysts noticed prime number sequences buried in the modulation, faint but unmistakable. Prime progressions are not natural noise. They are intention encoded into mathematics, the simplest possible signal of intelligence. Yet these weren't full messages. They were fragments, scaffolding, hints at a larger architecture we hadn't yet deciphered. Some cryptographers speculated the object might be performing a handshake protocol, testing clarity, adjusting amplitude, establishing a stable link before transmitting something more complex. Others argued that the modulations resembled a diagnostic report, like a machine testing its communication channels after reactivation. A few, quietly, raised a more intriguing possibility, that the signal wasn't for us at all. We simply happened to intercept it. The inference gap grew wider with each report. Why aim at Earth? Why the hydrogen line? Why the countdown-like shift before solar occlusion? And what disturbed me the most? Why did the frequency contain long intervals of perfect engineered silence? In communication theory, silence is rarely empty. It carries structure. It divides meaning. It acknowledges a receiver. I kept wondering whether those intervals were waiting for something, an echo, a response, or even a confirmation from somewhere we couldn't detect. The last data received before the object moved out of view left us with more questions than answers. The pulse held steady, the beam stayed locked, and the mathematical structure inside the transmission had reached its clearest state yet. It was as if the object had completed the first phase of whatever it intended to do. What came next would depend on what happened when 3i Atlas re-emerged from behind the sun. Whether it would continue the broadcast, change it, or vanish entirely, no one could predict. All we could do was wait for it to appear again and hope the silence didn't mean the message had already moved on. I kept returning to the final frames of data we received before 3i Atlas slipped behind the sun. The beam remained locked on our planet until the very last moment, as if holding a steady gaze before stepping into darkness. It felt deliberate in a way that left no room for casual interpretation. When the blackout period began, most expected silence. True, absolute silence. Instead, something completely unexpected emerged. During the first 72 hours of solar obstruction, several antennas detected a faint echo at the same hydrogen line frequency. At first, it looked like residual interference from the earlier broadcasts, but the more I examined the waveform, the more I realized it wasn't coming from interstellar space at all. It originated inside our upper atmosphere, a reflection or possibly a response carrying the same 11.3-second scaffolding but weaker, as if replayed through a distant filter. No one could explain explain how a planetary echo could mimic structured modulation so precisely. Some theorists suggested that our ionosphere might have acted like a vast resonant chamber, amplifying traces of the original signal. Others insisted that a natural echo would never match the nested patterns as cleanly as what we recorded. Several off-record observers implied something even more unsettling, that the echo was not a reflection, but a relay, transmitted back toward the sun, from the exact region 3I Atlas had targeted before disappearing. I couldn't dismiss that possibility. Meanwhile, internal models attempted to predict where the object would reappear once it crossed the solar limb. That was when another anomaly surfaced. A handful of long baseline observatories caught brief glimpses of optical distortions, flare shadows bending unnaturally around the object's projected location. At first glance, they resembled mirages caused by turbulent plasma. But the curvature of light in those frames didn't match known solar physics. It was too controlled, too consistent, almost as if space itself had taken on a subtle shape around the hidden body. Some physicists referred to it as an optical anomaly. In private conversations, a different term circulated quietly. Containment field, a structure of unknown origin bending radiation before it reached us. It was one of those ideas no one wanted to state officially, yet no one dismissed either. Then came the first unexpected telemetry spike, an abrupt compression of the pulse that matched the final pattern before disappearance. The nested harmonics inside the broadcast had transformed into something tighter, faster, more intricate. It was like watching a machine refine its voice, shedding its earlier ambiguity in favor of a clearer, more efficient signal. During the blackout, the complexity increased by nearly an order of magnitude. No natural process maintains that kind of continuity through occlusion. By the second week, a clearer picture began to form. The silence was not empty. Behind the sun, the object wasn't dormant. It was preparing. Theoretical teams built models suggesting it might be adjusting its internal structure, using solar radiation as a power source. That speculation gained traction when deep-field instruments detected faint, rhythmic thermal signatures, far too regular to be solar artifacts. They resembled the hum of a system charging, and then, on the 21st day, everything changed. 3I Atlas re-emerged slightly earlier than predicted, but the trajectory was no longer the same. It had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, by a fraction of a degree. That deviation could not be accounted for by gravitational calculations. A natural object drifting through the inner system shouldn't make course adjustments, especially not while hidden from external observation. But the most astonishing development was the signal. The narrow beam aimed at Earth was gone. In its place was a broad, outward-directed broadcast, still anchored on the hydrogen line but now functioning as a carrier for something far denser. The amplitude was higher, the structure was richer. The message, whatever it was, had become a torrent. When analysts examined the first packets of the returning data, they found prime sequences, geometric arrays, and patterns resembling biochemical structures, almost as if the object was transmitting a compressed summary of everything it had observed. Some pointed out an unmistakable set of signatures that paralleled carbon-based life. Others noticed faint traces of the atmospheric echo we recorded during the blackout, rebroadcasted from deep space like a confirmation receipt. This led to a theory that spread quietly among the research teams. 3I Atlas had completed an observational cycle. It had scanned Earth, confirmed the return ping, amplified its findings using the sun's energy, and was now sending a full report to a destination far beyond our reach. We weren't in communication. We were being archived. As the beam continued to stretch outward, the object altered course again, this time toward the asteroid belt. And in that moment, the earlier warning resurfaced in my mind. The possibility that the object wasn't simply a probe, but something capable of deploying smaller units. If that was true, then the next phase of its mission had already begun, somewhere between the rocks and shadows beyond Mars. But whether it was gathering resources, scattering sensors, or awaiting instructions, no one could say with certainty. All we knew was this. Whatever 3I Atlas is, it hasn't finished its work. And the next move it makes may finally reveal what kind of visitor we are dealing with. Observer, messenger, or something far more complex. I'll follow what happened next. I kept replaying the moment the object shifted its course toward the asteroid belt. Natural debris doesn't correct its path that precisely, especially after disappearing behind the sun for 3 weeks. And yet 3I Atlas moved with a confidence that felt engineered rather than accidental. The first signs of the next phase appeared sooner than anyone expected. The Vera Rubin Observatory, still running nightly calibrations, detected faint reflective anomalies near the object's new trajectory. At first they resembled fragments, small scattered points of light drifting away from the central body. Fragmentation is common in comets, but these points didn't behave like debris. They weren't tumbling chaotically, and they weren't spreading outward along the solar wind. Instead, they moved in synchronized formation, maintaining equidistant spacing as if guided by an internal rule set. The observation logs called them fragments. Privately, no one believed that term anymore. The word that kept reappearing in private channels was different: deployment pattern. Each reflective point shifted with uncanny precision. When one moved, the others adjusted in perfect geometric response. I watched the sequence several times, slowing down the recordings frame by frame. The more I studied them, the more undeniable the conclusion became. This was not a natural breakup. It was an activation. Soon after the swarm revealed itself, radio telescopes began detecting a new type of signal. It resembled neither the original 11.3-second pulse nor the later outward broadcast. This one was short, sharp, and recursive, a rapid ping cycling through multiple frequencies at once. It behaved less like a message and more like a scan, a type of cosmic sonar that expanded outward in a spherical wave, mapping everything within reach. The oddest part was that we couldn't pinpoint its origin. It didn't come solely from the central object, nor from the fragments. It appeared to radiate everywhere at once, as if the entire swarm functioned as a single distributed emitter. Some researchers suggested that each fragment served as a node, forming a network capable of constructing a shared high-resolution model of the environment. The idea of a hive mind, a distributed intelligence spanning millions of kilometers, became less speculative with each new dataset. And yet another detail kept troubling me. The pings didn't just scan the planets or the sun, they scanned empty space as if searching for something not listed in our catalogs. Why would an interstellar probe map the void with such intensity? What was it expecting to find there? As the swarm continued to expand and reorganize, the central body underwent its own transformation. Observatories in Hawaii captured images showing faint triangular plates shifting along the surface, rotating in perfect unison. The same patterns reported weeks earlier now moved like components sliding into new alignment. A few analysts compared it to the reconfiguration of a mechanical lattice, an architecture preparing for a new operational mode. The thermal signatures supported that idea. Instead of cooling as expected, the swarm fragments exhibited rising temperatures. Not from solar exposure, these increases were too abrupt and too consistent. They resembled a power-up phase, the heating of internal systems no longer dormant. Meanwhile, the main object began to emit a low, steady radiation pattern that matched no known chemical, nuclear, or fusion reaction. It was clean, coherent, almost like a quantum engine converting sunlight into ordered energy. I kept wondering whether these behaviors were stages of a pre-programmed process. Phase 1, approach. Phase 2, observe. Phase 3, acknowledge. Phase 4, transmit. And now, perhaps, Phase 5, replicate. The von Neumann probe hypothesis, once relegated to theoretical papers, suddenly felt alarmingly relevant. A machine designed to use local resources to build more of itself would need raw materials. And the asteroid belt, with its metals, carbon, ice, and silicates, offered everything such a probe might require. This thought gained weight when the swarm's coordinated motions changed direction. Instead of dispersing outward, the fragments slowly aligned into a spiral formation, a helix-like pattern strikingly similar to the visual signature encoded in the earlier broadcasts. The geometry was too familiar to ignore. It was as if the probe was replicating its own internal structure on a larger scale. Then came the shift in the main broadcast. The torrent of data that had been aimed into deep space suddenly paused, replaced by long intervals of structured silence. In communication, silence is rarely passive. It functions as punctuation, signaling separation between encoded blocks of meaning. But this silence felt different. It carried weight, as though waiting for a response from a source we couldn't detect. The possibility that the probe was receiving instructions, rather than only sending them, forced the research teams into a new line of questioning. If the probe wasn't acting alone, then whatever built it might still be listening, perhaps even coordinating the next phase across an unimaginable distance. Just before the end of the night cycle, a new anomaly appeared in the deep space tracking logs. The swarm fragments, previously arranged in geometric arcs, began accelerating, slightly but with measurable intent, toward a region of the asteroid belt rich in nickel-iron bodies. Their movement was methodical, synchronized, and silent, and as they advanced, the central body shifted again, its plates aligning around what looked like a magnetic axis. A coherent energy pulse flickered along the surface, not reflected sunlight. Emission. I wasn't sure what would happen once the swarm reached those resource-rich asteroids, whether it intended to mine, replicate, or initiate some other unknown process. But one thing was certain, the probe's behavior was no longer observational, it was operational, and whatever it planned next would determine whether this encounter remained a mystery or became something far more consequential for our place in the cosmos. I kept studying the acceleration curves of the swarm fragments as they moved toward the dense cluster of nickel-iron asteroids. Their motion wasn't random. It was orchestrated with a precision that implied not just internal coordination, but intent. Each fragment adjusted its position relative to the others with astonishing mathematical consistency. Nature doesn't behave that way unless guided by an underlying intelligence or a program built to mimic one. By the time the swarm reached the first minor asteroid, something remarkable happened. The fragments didn't collide or embed themselves. Instead, they arranged into a rotating shell around the rock, matching its spin as if synchronizing with its inertia. Thermal readings climbed steadily, showing rising temperatures on the asteroid's surface, not enough to melt it, but enough to suggest energy transfer. When the infrared signatures intensified, the conclusion became unavoidable. The swarm was beginning extraction. Not mining in any human sense, no drilling, no cutting, no visible discharge. The process was clean, almost surgical. Small tendrils of electromagnetic distortion flickered between the fragments and the asteroid's crust. Material began separating at the molecular level, disassembling into dust-sized particles before drifting toward the swarm in a controlled spiral. It was as if the fragments were feeding. Some researchers theorized that the process resembled an ultra-efficient form of resource conversion, where raw elements were reorganized into usable components without waste. Others suggested it might be a replication mechanism, assembling new units using only the minimal required mass. A few, in quieter rooms, proposed something stranger. The swarm might not be creating copies at all. It could be constructing a larger structure. As the asteroid continued to shrink, the central body of 3I Atlas began to change visibly. The triangular plates that once shifted subtly now moved with purpose, locking into new configurations that formed rings along its axis. It reminded me of a machine entering a new operational mode. The same symmetrical patterns the James Webb Telescope observed months earlier, those enigmatic 127-meter internal grids, began to glow faintly, as if resonance within the object had reached a new phase. Then came the pulse. It was unlike any transmission we had recorded before. Not the hydrogen line scaffold, not the nested harmonic sequences, not even the earlier directed beam. This was a single, sustained surge, broadband, coherent, powerful enough to saturate receivers across 3 continents. It lasted exactly 2.1 seconds, and then it stopped. When analysts dissected the waveform, something unusual stood out. It contained a near-perfect spectral map of the asteroid that had just been consumed. Its composition, its crystalline structure, even the distribution of its metallic veins. But embedded deeper, beneath the geological data, was something harder to interpret. A repeating structure resembling a geometric template. A blueprint. If the earlier phases suggested reconnaissance, this one suggested construction. As extraction continued across several nearby asteroids, the swarm reorganized itself into a vast spiral lattice, a 3-dimensional helix spanning hundreds of kilometers, anchored by the central body at its core. Each fragment emitted faint pulses that synchronized along the structure like the coordinated firing of neurons. Some observers compared it to a distributed processor. Others saw it as a scaffold for something not yet complete. The more I watched, the more I sensed that what we were witnessing wasn't random assembly. It was preparation. Meanwhile, the central body's own signal changed again. The outward torrent of data that once streamed into deep space slowed, replaced by structured silence punctuated with sparse bursts of compressed information. These bursts weren't aimed at Earth or at nearby planets. They were directed into the void, toward a region with no stars bright enough to host a known civilization. But the alignment was too deliberate to dismiss as meaningless. One cryptographer described the silence between those bursts as expectant, as if the probe wasn't transmitting, but waiting. If that was true, then 3I Atlas might not be reporting anymore. It might be requesting something. The last major event occurred at 0317 UTC, when the helix structure reached full activation. A coherent electromagnetic field spread across the entire formation. Weak, but unmistakably artificial. The asteroid-derived material had been woven into the lattice, forming a thin reflective membrane between the swarm units. In infrared images, the structure resembled the early stages of a vast, incomplete shell. What it was becoming, no one could say with certainty. A receiver? A transmitter? A propulsion array? A manufacturing platform? Or perhaps something entirely beyond our conceptual models? What unsettled me most was the shift in the probe's trajectory. For the first time since entering our system, 3I Atlas was no longer merely drifting with subtle corrections. It was accelerating, slowly, steadily, toward the outer solar system. Not away from us, but parallel to the ecliptic, as if positioning itself for the next stage of an ancient mission. As I watched the telemetry scroll across the screen, one thought kept returning. Nothing about this object's behavior suggested hostility, but nothing suggested indifference either. Its actions were efficient, calculated, and deeply purposeful. We weren't a target, but we weren't irrelevant. We were simply part of the environment it had been programmed to evaluate. What comes next? Whether the structure completes, whether the signal receives a reply, or whether the probe continues its silent work, remains unknown. All we can do now is observe, record, and accept a truth that feels larger than our place in the universe. Whatever 3i Atlas is building out there, it is no longer just a visitor, it is becoming something else. And whether we are prepared for what follows, that answer is still waiting in the silence between its pulses.